Hey everyone, this is going to be the first episode of On the Bubble, where we just talk about the bubble scene. We bring in people to talk about the bubble scene. And it's a pretty straightforward podcast. So today we have Ulti. He is the coach of 26 Rising, a Rank X team, and Mizzou Esports. So Ulti, is there anything else you want to add to yourself?
Pretty much covers it. I've been a coach for 6 years, just working in the industry.
Okay, so is it like a esports coach in general, or esports specifically with Rocket League?
With Rocket League, yeah.
Okay, so you've been around since coaching became a thing in Rocket League.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things when it comes to the bubble scene right now, at least that I've seen in conversation, is where does the bubble scene actually start? And where does it end? So I intentionally had a kind of a hot take on one. I was on this on one of the Twitter threads. I was like, it's anywhere from top 50 to top 9. So where would you say like the bubble scene starts and the bubble scene ends, and what's kind of your criteria for
Oh,
saying,
okay.
okay, they're no longer in the bubble scene,
hmm
and what does it take to be considered in the bubble scene?
I think my definition of bubble scene, I don't know if I ever actually looked at it like a numbers thing, like a top whatever. I've always experienced it as rank A, rank X kind of players, right? Typically who are on the cusp of going pro, but not quite there yet. They're on the bubble, you know?
Okay. So
Yeah.
do you think six mans is still the path to pro, or do you think it's changing a little bit?
It's a weird dynamic with six men's because ultimately they are the make or break in a lot of ways for a lot of people. Because if players make it to A or X, that's usually where they get notable teams. You can do it from B plus and B as well, but in my honest opinion, you have a better like setting at A and X. But if anything is outside of six men's, I'm not really too familiar with what works to make it to the pro scene outside of six men's because you don't really hear about it, you
Oh.
know?
So you think it's
Um,
mainly just notability, not necessarily player skill? That's kind of the main
yeah, it's
factor.
the unfortunate part about Rocket League being so industry dominated by younger, like 16, 17-year olds is that it's kind of like a popularity contest more than it is about functionality and just trying stuff out, you know?
Yeah, so the old should we have franchises debate.
Yeah.
But no, I guess that's be a good little segue. So when it comes to like RLCS formats, you've been around for a while. What's
Mhm.
been your favorite format, and what's been your least favorite format, and why is it the RLRS?
Man, I don't really know how to answer that question if I'm being honest, because I don't think I have enough experience with actually being involved with RLCS to know the format very well.
Mhm.
Um, if I'm being honest, I just watch the gameplay and get an idea of the players, but I don't pay attention to like what is it? The essentially like the formalities of the format, if you will.
Yeah, you just have the just win forehead mentality, pretty much.
Yeah,
Uh, uh,
exactly. I'm just looking at what can we do for our strategies.
yeah. Okay. So this is something that I've been considering a lot about the format, and more so from a business perspective, not
Mhm.
necessarily player perspective. Uh, but it helps players too. But my thought process is making RLCS 32 teams again. And I think instead of having like three different qualifiers,
Mhm.
like switching it up from basically have two qualifiers at the very beginning of a split, or two or three qualifiers for the beginning of a split, and like the top 8 from that make it, and then the next qualifier you add that next 8, and then you add another 8 with the last qualifier, and then you have like a miniature
Mm.
league slash Swiss system Uh,
That'd be interesting. Yeah,
to,
I knew that leagues were definitely of interest with a lot of people because um, I did speak with Seabass a little bit on this because he's one of the players that I work with on 26 Rising.
mhm,
We discussed about how there's so much talent right now going on
mhm,
for like interchanging teams.
mhm.
And so no team really has a defined spot because anyone could get there at any time kind of thing. Right? So
Yeah.
like the top 16, if you will, like the first four of that top 16 um at the lowest I should say.
Mhm,
Um are where teams are like you don't really know what bubble team is going to end up there, and they're constantly just switching back and forth. And then you have bubble teams beating pro teams
mhm.
and things of that nature. And it's like I think people are starting to realize that the skill base is a lot higher than what people expected,
Mhm.
and it's kind of it's almost not enough slots to have enough people, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think a few years ago it made sense,
Hmm.
just because there was a huge gap between
Yeah, it was
rank X.
massive, but the
Yeah.
gap is like shrunk now.
Yeah. The other thing that I think, just from the business side of it, is if we have a like mini season within the big season,
Hmm.
it's much easier for a team to go, hey, we've made it into RLCS for the spring portion of the season. Who
Hmm.
wants to sponsor us for that entire season?
Hmm.
Versus the top eight are basically guaranteed to make it. Do you really want to invest in a team as a business that
Yeah,
may
that's a
or
good
may
point.
not make it?
Hmm.
And even if they do make it, they may be out very quickly. I think if that's uh, switches to something similar to like a league or a Swiss system where they're getting more airtime, it makes it more investable for orgs. And then there's also more spots for orgs to invest into. And so I think that that will raise the amount of the bubble scene, or the amount being invested in the bubble scene, and more orgs getting involved with Rocket League. It's more money going to Rocket League, more going to players, etc.
Hmm.
And that's just going to help the scene grow. And I think that might be an easy way to do it, like for the next RLCS format. Uh, how exactly you run that league for a month and a half, that could be changed every time, kind of how they did a different thing for every split this time. Uh,
Hmm. It's interesting too, because if you look into it, there's a lot of different ways that the bubble scene could be given more attention.
mm-hmm,
I do like that idea. Um, there was some ideas that I was running with the team because we were just talking about it and shooting the shit, if you will,
mm-hmm,
and essentially talking about how the the general public doesn't really have incentive to care about the bubble scene,
mm-hmm,
right? And so essentially it's like top 8 are done, but there are players that are on their way up there that need that financial backing as well to kind of get a little bit of security going on, right?
yeah,
Because if I remember correctly, is it CS:GO?
mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with CS:GO at all, or?
A little bit. I was definitely more of a COD player growing up.
Okay, I'm not too familiar on CS:GO either, but I was trying to bring up. I'm pretty sure that they have like sponsorships at a very early stage in comparison to Rocket League, whereas
Mm-hmm,
like if you're there, you're there. You get the sponsorships, but along the way there, orgs work a little differently. You
mm-hmm.
know.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of academy teams in
Mhm.
CS:GO that are actually like an academy, not necessarily like, hey, you made it, so you'll get some free coaching. Like,
Mhm.
it's something that they actually invest more so, and it's a little bit more than just a league type thing.
Yeah, yeah. So it just seems like Rocket League doesn't have that support going on yet,
Hmm.
but it's also a weird boundary because where do you define a success potential team, right?
Hmm.
Because you have players that may not, what's the word? Like, there's a lot of inconsistencies in Rocket League, and there's no
Yeah.
promises that can be made,
Yeah.
which is the unfortunate part. It's like, "Hey, what are you gonna make it this time?" Well, we never know. It's RNG in a sense.
Yeah. Because, I mean, you just talk about bracket, placement. Like,
Mhm.
there's
Oh,
always
man,
that.
winners is so important.
Yeah. I mean, also, just like every RLCS split, there's at least one Mickey Mouse bracket that basically, like, a rank A team basically gets to day two for free, or maybe even like a B plus
Yeah.
team gets day two for free. And then
Yeah.
I think it was like our second split, like, we had you guys, then we had uh, Limitless uh, and Gentleman all in the same bracket, or it
Mhm.
was something close to that. And it's just like, why do you have three teams that have been top 16 in the same bracket, and then every
Yeah.
team that has never made a day two
In the other
in
one.
the other?
Yeah.
Uh, and so it's like, and I get seeding is hard, especially with it being an open qualifier. But I feel like maybe something they could do, like on that end, is kind of see where teams are stacking up, like outside of RLCS, uh, and being like, okay, like we're gonna start the groups with. There's gonna be one team that was top, uh, what is it? Like top 24, like 24 through uh 19.
Mhm.
Basically, didn't make the main event, but made day three, and just start the brackets with those people. And then on the other side of the bracket, be like, okay, here's the teams that they beat out to get to day three, and put them on the opposite side of the same bracket. And then maybe at that point, like randomly fill in the teams from there. But I think like something a little bit more deliberate, uh, like that. At least seeding like the first three or four people or teams, I think would help with consistency.
Yeah, just making sure that everyone has a chance, essentially.
Yeah, just making to where like grand
It's fair.
finals
Yeah.
matches aren't like something that should be a main event matchup isn't happening like round two of day one. Uh,
Hmm.
So, because I've seen that a lot in like randomly seeded tournaments, where it's like you have the two teams that everybody expects to make grand finals, but they're playing each other 2 to 3 matches in.
Yeah, and then it's just, like, so early that it just kind of kills out the hype later on because that's whenever everyone pays attention later on, you know?
Yeah, and then it's like they have to cast this complete blowout because it was poorly seeded.
Yeah.
And then
Uh,
it's like one team gets lucky and like the best of ones and like gets like random kickoff goals, or they get a bad server and it's best of ones and lowers, and so like they're out of that tournament, and then you continue to get like a really bad uh like grand final.
I think seeding has probably been the biggest factor with all of our attempts to pushing to day 2 and day 3. It
Mhm.
was always about, like, "Hey,
Mhm.
we're in this bracket, and by the way, we have the hardest climb possible."
Yeah,
And you'll never know. You'll never know which split you're gonna get a different bracket, you know?
yeah. I think what was I about to say with that? Like with the different seating, like what, because Liquipedia is useful to an extent, uh,
Mhm.
but it's still Liquipedia because it's like a bunch of weeklies. Like we could go and farm uh, like a $20 weekly and get Liqui points for it, and then like be a
Yeah.
top 30 team technically. Uh,
Yeah, exactly.
Not that I've been on a team that has done that before or
Top
something.
32 NA.
Yeah. Shout out to Defiance when I was coaching them. But no, like they were still a good team, but like top 32 and making it to day two, I think we made it twice when I was coaching them, or they had made it before, and then I helped them make it again.
Mhm.
But either way, like it's very hard to rate teams also because of like players switching so much. And
Yeah,
I
there's a lot of
think,
inconsistencies in that too.
yeah, and I think that's the other thing that I like about my idea with the league format is it keeps a team together for a split.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, if you're going to do this, you've got to play together for the entire split. You made it to the split, obviously sub options, and there's got to be some leeway for different circumstances and such. Uh,
It's a lot easier to kind of transition over to what you were saying with players essentially like getting different rosters all the time and
mhm,
that kind of nature. Um, it's kind of unfortunate too because that's also a part of the problem with the bubble
mhm.
scene.
Oh yes.
Just constant switching because they think it's not going to work.
Mhm.
Um, and there are really two ways that I've observed that to be why, like the reason for it, right? It's either the gameplay's just not going great and you just want to cut it off before it really gets anywhere, or the gameplay could do better, but at the same time, like the mentality of the person is unworkable,
Yeah.
right? So it's different if someone has a mentality where they truly just get like into that control mode, if
Mhm.
you will, where
Yeah.
they just want to like tell everyone else like how to play,
Mhm.
or want to like do constant reviews, constant scrims, like constantly scheduling things, right?
Mhm.
And then the people that are in it, like they would like their team could have been successful. That's the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And they're not successful anymore because of that one person
Mhm.
trying to grind it out with the other people in
Yeah.
that sense. Because what you do at that point is essentially like create burnout out of
Mhm.
those players and then they create another roster. But then you have the ones where it's like, "Oh, I don't like them. I don't like that person, so I'm just gonna go." That kinda thing, right? But it's like it's not actually something, it's almost judgmental more than it's about being curious.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I had to learn in I'm 26. So I had to learn, shout out to 26 Rising. I had to learn, um, how to basically get along with people because in the workforce, like if you don't like someone, the manager is gonna like essentially not really respond to your request to move for a second until you like give it a bit more time after the arguments, right? So like if you get
Mhm.
into a heated argument with someone, you're forced to deal with them because you have to come up to work next day.
Mhm.
But when it comes to being on a team, if you don't like someone, it's almost easier for you to just up and go to another one because there's just so many offers.
Mhm.
And I think that also creates problems because if you think about it, teams that stay formed by struggle, like teams that have struggle in the beginning, get their stuff together, and then like essentially get all on the same page is so much more valuable because it bonds more, right?
Yeah.
If you don't get along with someone in the beginning and then you get along with them later and things are great, it almost gives you a positive perspective on life
Mhm.
because it shows you that a lot more people are able to discuss things than you might give them credit for.
Yeah. So what you're
So,
saying is if you want to be a professional Rocket League, you should learn how to be a professional in general.
yeah,
Yeah.
essentially, right? It's like it
Weird
shouldn't be this
concept.
high school, it shouldn't be
Yeah.
like this high school popularity contest, right?
Mhm.
It should be much more about like if I don't get along with them, if I'm able to talk with them like rationally, right? Like if
Mhm.
you just go up to them and say, "Well, this is my argument," and then you give your counter, and before you even let them finish, you're cutting them off the whole time, right?
Mhm.
It's like you're not really being as cooperative as you think? So it's not even the idea of them being quote unquote more professional to get to pro. It's just more about like just understand that. I mean, it's almost like asking them to be older in a sense, you
Yeah.
know? And that's a hard ask.
Mhm.
Like, how do you get that out of a team?
Yeah. I think
So, I don't know,
that's
it's up to speculation at that point of what the actual answer is, but that's just what I've noticed?
yeah,
So
I think that's where to a certain extent like top down approaches work better.
mhm,
Like for instance, uh Accelerate's doing this right now. Like they have what's his name? Starts with the W. The Zookeeper's old coach,
Hmm.
or where
I don't remember
it's like
who
one
is it.
Kasan or something.
Oh,
Oh no,
Rungskin. Yeah,
yeah,
Rungskin. That's
yeah.
right.
So like
It's been a while
he's
since I talked to him.
yeah. So I was in his Twitch chat the other day, and he was talking about how like he's not trying to find a team; he's trying to find players and recruit them, and he's building the team and like doing that, and like so that's the first time I've ever really seen a top-down approach. Uh, Typically what I've found is it's typically one person on a team that has a coach that they like, and then they go and recruit the other players, but it's like the team captain's still in a sense in charge of the team and over the coach.
Hmm.
And so it's like if he doesn't like what the coach says, then it's like you kick the coach and then you get a new coach and then you're learning something entirely different. And then
Yeah, that's
like
another thing. It's like it, but see, that's like a powerful. I mean, that's a really fragile balance, right? Like to
yes.
maintain because you try having the team leader be the good guy, and then like have the coach be the one that's replaceable, and then you have the other one where the coach is the bad guy, and then the players are replaceable. And to
Mhm.
me, neither work, right? Like
Yeah.
it's the idea that no one needs to have a power dynamic here. Everyone's
Hmm.
on the same page.
Yeah.
One thing I had to learn, especially, was that players are essentially like running the show much more than coaches.
Yeah.
And mhm,
Especially at this point in Rocket League. I think that may change in
yeah.
the future, but definitely not anytime within the next 3 to 4 years.
Yeah, my thought was always that like as long like right now, all you need to get into RLCS right now is a solid mentality
Hmm.
and just making sure that you're playing as a solid player individually. But once you get to players that are also doing that and are like-minded in that sense, then you now have players that are needing strategies because that's what works now. Now they need like the in-depth teamwork stuff, right?
Hmm.
But in order to get like what like the first four slots, right?
Hmm.
You just got to be really good in general, like just by your like your own individual plays, right?
Yeah.
Once you get those individual playing like plays down, you have a really solid shot.
Yeah. I think that's the other thing too is like, how do we judge individual players?
Right.
Because I know like there's different teams, and I also coached a college team.
Hmm.
Funny story about how I got in the bubble scene.
How'd that go?
Uh, so I was coaching his college team that's like GC1 and 2C2s
Hmm.
at the time. And this was back in March. So I'm still relatively new to the bubble scene. Uh,
Oh, really? Okay.
yeah. And so we got in bandits. I was just like, hey, look, like, we can't really find good scrims. And there's no way we could get these people to scrim us. And they're way better than us comparatively. So let's just enter bandits like every week and get our butts kicked. And so we can see like what the top is like. Uh,
Hmm.
and so we do that, and we get some good replay reviews, and then we take a game off a rank A team.
Hmm.
And so that kind of put me on the map with a few people. It's just like, wait a minute, what happened? And I actually talked to one of their former teammates. I was like, hey, like, were they trolling or were they really trying? He goes, they trolled for 30 seconds and then they were actually trying the rest of the game. I was like, all right, great. So that's
Yeah,
kind of
I
how I
don't know
got in
what
the
that
bubble
is
scene.
too. That's
Huh?
a really cool way to get into it too, because that
Yeah.
actually shows like proof of concept, which is nice.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think we're entering into like an era where coaching and strategy is going to be much more important. I don't think the standard rotation uh,
Hmm.
is going to be around for much longer. Uh, Ranked is very different from competitive already
Yeah, exactly.
because it's very much built on trust but verify your teammate. To a sense, where it's
Yeah.
like you're gonna trust them, but you're gonna typically err on the side of they're gonna mess up. Uh, ex-
Yeah, exactly. It's about like adapting off of them essentially.
yeah.
Yeah.
Versus competitive, it's like you've got a system,
Yeah. Yep.
and so now it's like it's been the same system for a very long time,
Hmm.
And I think just now, like, so I'm very anti-meta thinking. So I was just like, what does every team do? All right, let's figure out a way to stop what every team does, or at least throw them off and not have seen what we're doing before. And so that's part of how we took that game. Uh, but I think now also just with how much depth there is in the bubble scene,
Mhm.
as well as how consistent the top is. Like I think now is when like the coaching, like we're about to enter that era of the coaches and strategy, and like the big brains uh, prevailing, not
See, I
just the
don't know how I feel
mechanical.
about that too, because so you're on the anti-meta side.
I
I'm
wouldn't necessarily,
actually, well, no, I get what you mean though,
yeah,
but like not necessarily anti as in it's wrong and bad, more so like what can we do to change it to see if it works better kind of thing, right?
more so like what's the like weaknesses to it.
Hmm.
It's like what's the thing that people aren't thinking about. It's like
Yeah, so
it
just looking at current holes in the wall,
yeah, pretty
essentially.
much, yeah.
Yeah.
Just be like,
I used to. Sorry, go ahead.
it's like kind of like if everybody like a real example of this, like that's if you play ones at all, it's just like okay, they're ball chasing me, so I'm just gonna hit it past them,
Hmm.
and they're just gonna insta challenge, and as long as I pop it over them, it's a goal. Or
Hmm.
you start doing that, then they go, okay, they're not insta challenging anymore. Now I'm gonna dribble the ball and flick it, you know, and they're gonna have to shadow defend. And then you do that enough times, then they're like, oh, well, now they've got to play closer because my flicks are good. And you go back to shots. So it's kind of that back and forth between the two. Uh, so, quick lesson on ones for everybody. But it's looking at the meta that way,
Hmm.
but obviously in a much more complex 3v3 setting.
Yeah. So I had a conversation with Subban a while ago, back when he was coaching E United, and it was
Hmm.
like probably in the first. I don't actually know. I think it was like in his early times with E United, and we were just discussing like the meta and like how coaches kind of don't necessarily run the show, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's usually that each player is running their own individual machine
Hmm.
with their own coding, their own programming language, all that kind of stuff. And your job as a coach is to find a way to interpret instructions in a way that they will be able to put it into their machine and still function properly.
Hmm.
That's probably the best analogy I've ever learned
Yeah.
about it. Um, and how coaches are essentially not necessarily taking over. Like I don't think the future is all about coaches running the show, if I'm being honest, because I think it's less like it's less like American football and more like you know uh, I want to say soccer, but I also want to say European football.
Hmm. Yeah.
but
Hmm.
but essentially, it's a lot more like soccer, where you give them instructions outside, and then you let them do their thing inside. You don't
Hmm.
touch it.
Yeah.
Right? It's like if they're on the field, you don't have communications with them. If they're outside of the field, you have communications with them, which I'm pretty sure is actually how RLCS works right now.
Hmm.
Coaches can't really talk to them when they're in game, right?
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
not sure about that. I know.
I
I'm.
know there was some complaints about like they couldn't even sit in the same voice chat. Like
Mhm.
they had to be in a bystanding one and then move over or something of that nature, or they had to be muted and their admins watching. I don't remember what it
Yeah.
was, but I think there is some technicality to that.
Yeah. I think that's going to be interesting. But even then, like, I think where I see Rocket League going, and when I say
Mhm.
this is going to be like the era of the coaches, is it's going to be our teams are equally as consistent and as skilled. So it's going to be my strategy versus your strategy. And we're
Mhm.
going to have to prep multiple strategies or rotations, so to speak. And I'm going to have to call the right rotation against that. And maybe like during kickoffs, be like, okay, they're doing this. So now we need to do this type of rotation. And I
Mhm.
think that's where Rocket League eventually will head, especially once they let coaches like be in comms with the team. if that's
I don't
not
know.
already a thing.
I don't know if that's how I feel on it. But I should mention, like, I'm not saying that you're wrong or I'm right kind of thing. I don't know. Um, with my understanding, it's always been that a player thrives off of being themselves, and the best version of themselves is what you want to promote. And
Hmm.
then trying to have them strategize constantly and all that nature, you would have to do a good job of making sure that they could actually like stay with that functionally based off
Hmm.
their own play style. Um, and then like keep that in mind because if you try and have them do different things that they're not uh like naturally
Hmm.
inclined to do, then
Yeah.
you run into problems because they're being a lesser version of something they're not.
Yeah. And I think that's where becoming a complete player is going to be more important than being able to peak in a certain way,
Hmm.
if that makes sense. Like you're
I'm not
gonna,
sure. I'm not
because
sure.
things have always been slowly meshing together between like it used to be there is the first man of the team and the second man of the team and the third man of the team.
Hmm.
And now first and second man are starting to kind of muddy together as to who is who on that team. And there's still like a typical strong third man,
Hmm.
uh, just as like a player role. But even that's starting to change now with how aggressive offenses are having to be to score, between who's
Yeah, it's
really
a
the
very
third man.
pressure heavy meta right now.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, like, you're not able to just be a good first man anymore. Uh, you've got to be good at everything. And that's slowly starting to melt together. And so, I think as that begins to happen, uh, it's not going to be like first man, second man, third man. It's going to be this system because everybody can do every job equally
My
as
thought was
well.
always like whatever they're physically confident is whatever they're physically capable of,
Hmm.
right? And so the rotations aspect to me, like rotations obviously play a massive role, especially when it comes to strategy in the higher
Yeah.
levels, right? Um, but I do think that a lot of it comes into the player's capabilities and what their
Hmm.
strengths are, because once again, to have them all rounded, like the a jack of all trade has no specialties kind of
Hmm.
argument.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I think that's leaning to.
Hmm.
I don't think you could have them be all around players in a sense, because in doing so, you weaken what they're already really solid at.
Yeah. And that's where I think it's going to be more about team play and like less the individual,
Hmm.
if that makes sense. uh
So
like
like a
'cause-
playbook, essentially.
yeah, like I think it's going to be like you're not necessarily like obviously like you can't call a play and it be like this is exactly how it's going to happen
Hmm.
in Rocket League, but you can have a hey, we're going to do this in this way. We're going to aim for this type of interaction uh, with the other team. And if, and like have like one or two things that if it's going to happen in one of 2 to 3 ways, like that interaction with an opponent. And so building a system around, we're going to put them in this situation and one of these things is going to happen. And we're hoping for this one, but we've got these other ones covered. And you're going to be trying to pick apart the weaknesses of the other team by putting them in those situations or drawing players uh, and conditioning players to respond to a certain thing. So that way
Hmm.
they open up another side of the field. I think that already kind of happens to a certain extent subconsciously, just because the players have so much game sense. But I think it's going to happen, that conditioning is going to happen much more intentionally
It's
moving forward.
interesting. So theoretically, if that is the case, like if
Mhm.
we get to that point where the highest level is like just strategy overrides everything in individual, right?
Mhm.
If we run into that, what would then be the odds of say 15 or 16-year-old teams like showing up and like destroying the field with their own individual? Like if that's the case, then that would mean that strategy would override pretty much all individual chances, right?
It's always going to be like a chance. So it's kind of like it's a balance between the two. I don't think it will ever be
Mhm.
just teams, but or just solo play capability.
Mhm.
It's always going to be a spectrum of the both. But I think right now the spectrum is just so far to the solo play uh, that most teams, it's all about getting a free ball to their third man and
Mhm.
hoping that they have boost and then letting Daniel 1v3 or letting Vatira 1v3. You know, like it's,
Yeah.
if you look at it, it's like, you know, uh, or like version one, it's like, you know, Com goes and demos and creates that extra space. So instead of having to do a 1v3, it's a 1v2. Uh,
Yeah, exactly. Calm just becomes an absolute nuisance on offense.
yeah. And so, like, you're already seeing like a certain level of strategy with that.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think that there is so much more room for that uh,
Mhm.
than people realize. Especially like if you're just a casual watcher, you're just like, oh, they're driving in circles, and that guy occasionally cuts somebody off. It's like,
Right.
you know, versus like having set ideas about what are we doing, what's our positioning.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or like how BDS is like constantly matching pace of the play the whole time and just
mhm,
like going the second that they have a chance off of anything.
yeah, and so like that's where it's just like, okay, we're gonna go for ego challenges
Yeah.
to make them have to go to the ball faster. And then
Yep.
once they start going
Exactly.
for the ball faster, our fake challenges are going to be more effective. And
Mhm.
so, like, I think you're going to be planning out series against teams, not just individual games. And I think Fireburner's already doing this. I've heard a few interviews where with Calm, how he was just like, yeah, Fireburner basically like sat us down, was just like, hey, here's how we beat this team. We're going to play differently against this team, and then we're going to do this against this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, so it's based off of what their characteristics are,
yeah,
right? Things of that nature, saying like, "Hey, the uncontrollable factors that these teams have against every team that they face is what we're going to capitalize on."
yeah.
Yeah,
And
things of
so,
that nature.
yeah. And so I think it's already starting to happen at the higher level.
Mhm.
I just think it's going to shift more into the strategy side, especially in the bubble scene, because most bubble players don't have, you know, Daniel's mechanics or Vatira's mechanics,
Mhm.
or just the entire team of Falcon or Furia's mechanics.
Right.
Yeah, once you have somebody on your team that's like Jan, like you're at least gonna make top 16.
At this point, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. It's interesting to speculate. It's definitely cool to think about how it's gonna change, but I don't know. It's always this thing of like you can theorize as much as you want, but until it's there, you'll never know.
yeah.
Yeah.
I
Cool
think
on paper, maybe not practicality, but we'll see, you know?
Yeah, I think that's like a. So part of the reason I developed that system is like the college team that I was coaching. They were two of them were American football players.
Mhm.
So the concept of them studying and learning a playbook was something that was very like natural to them. And so instead of trying to be like, okay, and like this to recognize this situation, you do this. Uh, like drawing it out and be just like this interaction at us, our team versus their team, is
Mhm.
them doing nickel defense while we're doing a halfback dive. Essentially, is how it's just like so.
Yeah, yep, totally yep.
Yeah,
I
and
don't know what you
so
said.
yeah, so it's just like there's different defenses, there's different defensive formations, and there's different things that formation is good against, and then you'll fake that formation to draw them in to do something. Like there's a whole
Mhm.
lot of strategy to that. But it's just like being able to say, hey, we're going to follow this in this step, and it's going to happen. One of these three things is going to happen as long as, we just don't completely whiff the ball. Uh, and then being able to break that down so that way they're not trying to get all the game sense and trying to read every situation. It's just like, hey, we're going to shoot
Mhm.
for this. If it happens, great. If it doesn't happen, here's our exit strategy. And I think that style, once it gets at the higher level where it is that consistent, uh,
Mhm.
that's where it's gonna be less and less those individual plays because people can just match those. And I think the plays are then going to enable those solo plays.
Mhm.
Uh, so it's not necessarily like the strategy is what's going to break the defense down and then enable the solo play to happen easier. Uh,
Gotcha. Yeah.
so
So
it's
just
always going to be that
overall,
spectrum.
yeah, so just overall, essentially, what are their weaknesses? And even if they have the ability to essentially stop that weakness,
Hmm.
how can we try and keep that from happening?
Yeah, it's like every strength is a risk.
Mhm.
It's like if you go
Yeah,
up for an air
exactly.
dribble, you know, if you're taking your time with it because you've got to get that perfect touch to keep it under control, that's
Mhm.
strength to have that control. But because you're having to slow down, it makes you really easy to demo out of the air.
Yeah. I like to think of the variables as like chess,
Yes.
right? It's like you can only do so much to predict the game until it goes outside of your strategy, and now you have to improvise,
Yeah.
right? Like there are
But even then,
players that.
like your
Mhm.
system, I'm a chess player too.
Oh,
Oh,
nice.
so I'm a London system guy. What about you?
Golly,
Okay. So
which is
yeah.
super basic, I know, but
Yeah, but even then,
I
it's
like
just
it.
like the London system in Kali, like you're still trying to do a certain thing and it has its certain strengths. And
Mhm.
so, like, you can still more or less force your opponent to make certain moves or they
Yeah,
just lose or trick them into certain moves and,
yeah.
at the lower level.
Mhm. I guess my point is though, like essentially you want to avoid the blunders, but mistakes happen all the time kind of
Yeah.
thought process, right?
Yeah.
And then it's all about where are the pieces on the field, where do they typically like to go,
Hmm.
and what do they typically like to do that can be therefore accounted for and possibly countered, you know? And then it's going to be about how do strategies like try to counter out. It's like going to be this complex thing where it's going to layer on strategies if that's the
Hmm.
case,
Yeah.
where people are going to be like, okay, we need a strategy against these people, but they're going to know that we're going to strategize against it like this. So now we have to do this
Yeah. And I
kind of
think
thing.
that's where teams are eventually going to have to start learning playbooks and not just play
Mhm.
their style.
I do think we're still quite a way, like quite a way away from that still.
Yeah, I think we're probably at least 2 to 3 years from it being mainstream, but I
Mhm.
think that's the next up and coming
I feel like I would
situation.
have to talk with a lot more pros to know the answer to that question.
Yeah, because I think right now it's still so much based on like individuals' consistency and solo playability. Uh,
Yeah, I remember a player, I don't want to say out their name, but
yeah.
there was a player in one of the EU top teams that told me that it's basically all mechanic based right now. Like
Hmm.
everything is just mechanics. Like
Hmm.
whoever has the best mechanics therefore has more options and can therefore do more. But the one thing he told me was like there is no strategy. Um in a sense that's true, but I would also argue like if there is no strategy, then I'm not sure how teams would then come up with ways to beat other teams. I feel like there has to be a game plan of some kind. Maybe just not like a formula, if you will.
Yeah, like if you look at the SSG versus Falcons gameplay
Mhm.
at the London LAN, when SSG turned it around, you can see it if you go back and rewatch that series. You'll see that basically Ocalid or somebody would take it up into their corner, but instead of trying to play it around him, they forced him to take a 50 because he just drove it straight at the net. And he's one's main, so he takes 50s like nobody's business. And
Mhm.
he would pass it with the 50 to his teammate with a speed, and his teammate would be perfectly positioned where he could take an immediate shot on net that they weren't ready for. And that was like
Yeah, but
essentially their
I guess
game
the
plan.
question,
And then you see Chrome talking to
yeah.
him, and then you see them start to intentionally lose 50s, like in the second and third game, so that way they don't turn into passes. It's a more
Mhm.
dangerous situation for them And then they kind of iron out their 50s and they start that near reverse sweep.
Hmm.
And so that's just one of the main things I noticed from that series. There's a lot more, but I think that's just, if you're an average viewer, that's the easiest thing that you could go back and watch and be like, oh, that's what he's doing. And then,
Yeah.
Game 7 rolls around and uh, Falcons adjust how they take their 50s and they start to do a little bit more direct passing. But so, like, I think it's at the high level, like, the changes you have to make are so small between games
Yeah.
that it just,
It's all about where are they getting their strength and how can we exploit that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think, coming up with those different systems in different formations, because it's like, okay, if we're winning these 50s or they're taking these 50s, then we want to do this. But within the same formation, if they're now starting to do this or delay 50s, or we're just not getting our 50s in today, uh, like, what's the secondary option with this formation?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think once you do that, if you can figure out the other team's, strategy, it's going to be easier to play against. You still have to mechanically execute.
Yeah. So we are still showing examples of doing that. I mean, even now. So maybe even 3-4 years may not be unrealistic.
Yeah, and that's why I say it's getting there. I just don't think it's quite to the level of like standardized, like,
Yeah, it hasn't been implemented as much yet, essentially.
yeah, like if you talk to a football team and you go, hey, play a cover 2 defense, just like if you've ever played American football or if you've ever played Madden, you have some idea that that means you're going to keep 2 safeties deep in the backfield so that way they can't throw it over the top of you.
So you think do you think that I mean, I suppose the answer is already yes, because I'm pretty sure we've answered this. But essentially saying right now the teams are ran by the players and the
Mm-hmm.
coaches kind of like generally guide them, but not
Mm-hmm.
really tell them what to do.
Yeah. And I
Do
think
you
that's the
think that it's going to
difference.
get to the point where it's going to be where they tell them what to do?
I think that's why the top teams are the top teams.
Hmm.
Because if you look at the top teams, they have coaches that are geniuses, like Fireburner, or Chrome. And like
Hmm.
the thing that I think makes those teams consistent is that their coach is able to break down. I think the other thing too is because the pool is so small, they only really have to prepare for like 6 teams for the most part. Uh, like every other team, they can just kind of outclass to a certain extent. But that's why I think those top 4 teams are consistently the top 4 teams now, is because they're focusing in on strategy more than the other teams. They still have the solo play capability, but that's
Hmm.
what's making them stay at the top for so long.
Hmm.
And I think that's part of why NRG started to fall off, is because they never changed their strategy for the most part. Like, it got to a point where people just kind of figured out how to beat them. They
I
were
don't
still,
know. I'm pretty sure I remember seeing like Justin mentioning that like he looks at his replays all the time
Mhm,
and like he's always trying to figure out what to do.
mhm. And I think that's a difference between like having a player mindset and having like a coach strategy mindset. Like, it's one thing to, like, if all you've ever played is Rocket League, you're kind of limited in like your thought processes versus we're both chess players. So our
I don't
thought
I
process,
don't play that much, but yeah,
to a
I
certain
know
extent, yeah.
enough.
So like chess players, it's like the decent chess players think 3 to 5 moves ahead. So like really good chess players are thinking, 9 moves ahead in all their variations. You
Yeah,
know,
exactly. But
uh,
I think also with Rocket League it's kind of impossible to do that in a sense
I think
because
it's more. I think it's closer to chess in that it's a close game to a certain extent. There's only a certain amount of interactions that can happen, uh,
hmm,
and now the follow-up interactions, like that's what you kind of have to plan for. But even those follow-up interactions, they all kind of fall into either you're just completely late to the play. You're giving them so much space that you can't get in a shadow position, or you're taking a late 50, you're 50ing them at the same time, you're beating them to the ball, or you're
Hmm.
taking the 50 early. Like it's everything falls essentially into one of those five categories. Uh, and so I think Rocket League is a little bit more predictable than most people think. At least from like a theoretical. Like yes,
Hmm.
it can how that interaction happens like
Yeah, the variables and how it essentially
sure. Yeah,
ripples out, the ripple effect, right? Like the aspect of the play goes down, and then what are the variables that are going to end up after that? Because that's what needs to be
accounted
addressed.
for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think just like for the most part, you can judge things like there's like a spectrum of just like we can predict that this is probably going to happen like this 90% of the time. Like there's always going to be those weird 50s in your corner that just get pinched in your net, uh,
Hmm.
and you don't want to have your game plan, being
Yeah,
afraid
you
of that
focus on the
1%
highest
chance happening.
probabilities. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think to a certain extent, it's almost like chess if your pieces could whiff, you know?
Hmm.
Uh,
It's an interesting concept. Like I know what you mean,
mhm.
and there's definitely room to see that in the highest level, but I still don't quite. I don't know. Like I said, I would want to get perspective from other people before I rely on myself for that,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. Because I can only speculate. Even if I like think I have the answer, I need to know from them to really know what's going down. You know?
Yeah. This is obviously speculation for me too. I just
Yeah.
have a background in sales, so everything I say is convincing. Wink, wink. Speaking of convincing, you guys should check us both out on Medify. He said Ulti's a CRL coach for Mizzou and for 26 Rising, and I coach for a college you have never heard of, uh, and then a team called Audacity. Shameless plug. But yeah, I guess what else? Is there anything like specific to the bubble scene that you wanted to talk about? I think we kind of
Covered a
covered quite
lot
a
of it,
bit
to be
today.
honest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, can we talk about how having a council in Rank X is a terrible idea?
Yeah. That's
Oh man, why
if
is
that's
that
not
a
a high
thing?
school popularity contest,
Yeah,
what
that's what
is?
I meant too. I was
Yeah.
like, dude, the idea that someone can just cut you off, like no matter how good you're playing, if they don't like you, that's it.
hmm I think that's
Even if they don't like you, it might be
mhm.
that you're a threat to them,
Yeah.
right? It's a control privilege, and I hate that.
Yeah, I think that's just the MMR system in general for both ranked and six mans. Like
I mean,
giving the
it's always
same.
been rough to do that too, though.
Yeah,
Like
it's
it's
not an
always been
easy
rough to get
problem to
that.
solve.
Yeah,
Like,
by
because
all
if you go
means.
off of scoreboard points, it's like the ball chaser is the best team player on the team according to that. When that's
Sure,
obviously not the case.
sure. Well,
But
I don't know about. So, what do you mean by that exactly? So, like, what does that have to do with the six-man side of it? I suppose.
well, they have an MMR system too. It's
Yeah.
win loss. It's relatively the same. To ranked as far as like you win, you get so many points, you lose so many points. But for the most part, it's as a team, you know.
Yeah.
Like there's no individuality to like, well, this person carried the whole game and these guys threw, so we're not going to punish him so hard and punish them more. Because
I feel
obviously,
like.
like, it's very
Hmm.
hard to do, like, to judge that, especially like from a computer level. Uh,
Yeah, but so when I think of that though, right? When I think of like in the game, because you're talking about essentially the idea that no one has control over truly whether or not they climb based on the variabilities,
to a
right?
certain extent. I wouldn't. You would, like if I put you in a bronze two lobby, or you know,
Sure,
eh,
sure. Right,
like you
right.
would definitely
It's
be able to
outclassing.
carry.
But if
Yeah.
everyone's the same skill, you would say that the variables are too strong to actually like no, it's almost RNG as to whether or not you're going to be successful or not because it just depends on whether or not you play better. at
Well,
that
I would
skill,
say
right?
like not
Or
even
no?
that. Like I would say the skill gap is so large
Okay,
within
so
the same
the
rank.
top of rank B and the lowest of rank B therefore have such a like changed like a difference to them, right?
Yeah, like you could have like if I took a random sample of everybody that was like 1600 MMR right now
Hmm.
and ranked or in six mans, the skill difference and the knowledge difference is so large within that
Yeah, of course.
because if you win a game because you get carried, you get MMR too.
Yeah.
And so if you get there's a certain amount of luck and standard deviation and all that maths, but that's going to carry you up so far. But then now you're a really good player that's also 1600, but you are unlucky and you get teamed with them. So that's bringing both of you down when really you shouldn't even be in that 1600 MMR range to begin with.
Hmm.
Both the person should be much lower and the person should be much higher. But just because it groups everybody together, uh, and there is no difference between the player that's did their job and the player that didn't do their job when it comes to the MMR win or loss,
Hmm.
I think that's where the system's kind of flawed. And that's why like rank B has such a big gap. Even B plus to a certain extent. And then all of
I don't
ranked.
know. How
So
much do you run into though where like the players truly just think it's their teammates and then they think like that they're just doing everything like quote unquote perfect to their play style, you know?
yeah,
That kind of nature. Because that's a big part of it too, right? Like
yeah,
whether or not a player is able to maintain their effectiveness based off of what they're exposed to on the players,
yeah.
right? But I would also say like reading the body language and getting an idea like when you go on a game, right? I
Mhm.
remember listening to Garrett G and he talked about how like I think he said like the first 3 minutes of the first game, he's testing the waters,
Yeah.
right? And so essentially in the same concept, you're reading the body language and the tendencies of those players. And the idea is the better you get at doing that, the more predictable those players become over time.
Yeah.
And the more predictable they become, the more you can actually start doing stuff against them.
Hmm.
And I think that is what helps players essentially make their climb rather than just like saying, oh, I'm doing everything or I'm doing nothing, you know?
Oh yeah, like that's definitely an aspect. Being able to the adaptability is important,
Yeah.
but there
Yeah.
does eventually get a point where like your teammates can throw the game, and there's only so much you can do.
100%. Yeah,
Uh,
you can't win them all, sure, but you're much more statistically likely to win more
yeah.
if you're more solid of a player. And so I think you're still able to like it's a lot easier for people to be on it than it is for people to be off of it, in my
Hmm.
honest opinion.
Hmm. I
So,
think you. I think especially from what I've seen, because I've been in uh, like coaching calls and stuff like that. Like as people are
mhm,
playing games, like in rank, just being like, okay, like let me see how you guys communicate. Like
mhm,
but or how you play your ranked game,
mhm.
replay reviews like in the moment type situations. And it's like,
Yeah,
okay, there's nothing you could have done there because your teammate stole your boost, bumped you ball chasing because he rotated near post and he was ball
sure.
chasing. Like there's situations like that. And the big problem with the ELO system is that it treats you and that player who completely threw the game the same. And I think that's where
But now you're getting
because
into like a big ask because how do you
oh yeah,
change that, you know?
yeah,
Like that's like an AI
oh
needing to
yeah,
know like every single
yeah,
bit and portion of what is current meta, and then even that can change. So how is an AI even going to stay consistent with that? You know?
yeah. And I think that's where like why six mans is starting to lose its popularity on top of uh the rank X council is because they haven't figured out a system like that. And I think the other thing is
Yeah, like we said
when
though, that is a big ask.
yeah, I think the main thing that made it worse is when like Psionics put everybody at 600 MMR for new
Oh
accounts.
yeah, yeah,
Like you do that, and then you basically eviscerate the bottom three ranks. You then push all those players up,
Mhm.
And so there's a lot more carried players that then also get into like rank B type situations. And so
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
because I know a few players that like they definitely should be like rank A,
Mhm.
like mechanically and like game sense wise, but they just get unlucky 6-man skews, and so they aren't respected, and then it's hard for them to get scrims and so on and so forth. And then I know a lot of players that are mad that they think they should be rank A, and they definitely shouldn't be. So, uh, but I think like there needs to be a better system than 6-mans or ranked. Uh, so, what do you
I would
think?
agree. I think there needs to be more incentive, but I think we tried that already with like the field, right?
Mhm,
And the field was great for a time. Like it started out amazing, but then
mhm,
teams that were like higher up than most of the players that were dealing in it,
mhm.
they just didn't see any incentive because they weren't getting paid enough,
Yeah.
you know? And I think there has to be some level of understanding from the professional scene as well, but there's
Mhm.
no real incentive towards it for kids, especially. When
Yeah.
you think about it, there is a level of respect that goes into the sport that you have to provide as a professional. There's
Mhm.
not just the money materialistic aspect, right?
Yeah.
It's like sometimes you want to make sure, or sorry, sometimes it's better for you to just disregard how much you get out of it in terms of what you get out of it, more than just saying this is going to increase competition in the scene to
Mhm.
increase growth. And
Yeah.
the more growth that we have, the more exponentially we can make profit in the future.
Yeah. A rising tide raises all ships.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's there. I think there needs to be also like less egoing to an extent.
Hmm.
But
And we've discussed that too. That's the high school popularity contest, and also
yeah.
just that mentality of like saying, well, there's no other option. And then, you say, okay, well, my past three teams were like this. And that means that like I have reasonable data, if you will, to say anyone like this is going to be a problem, right? But
Hmm.
the thing is, you might not be as open as you think you are, you
Yeah.
know? And so it's a lot of like a coach or even a manager,
Hmm.
in a sense, has to be like the big brother or sister, right?
Yeah.
Like they have to be the ones that are like life guidance material, but not
Hmm.
necessarily like just part of the argument. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You don't want to corner in on a team just because you or like corner in on one player of the team just because you only agree with one side,
Hmm.
right? It's more about like there needs to be a reasonable aspect towards how are we going to deal with this,
Hmm.
and bickering and yelling at each other and also never listening to each other is just never going to work.
Yeah.
You all need to communicate, and communication isn't giving your point. Communication is letting people give their point and you listen to them, and you take in their point and then you evaluate it after it's all given. But you don't just shut it down because you don't believe it in the beginning, because that just means that you're not willing to change,
Yeah. It means you're
you know?
opinionated. It's like right there, just
Yeah.
waiting for the person to finish talking, and instead of just being like, all right, man, I can't wait to say this one liner when Ulti finishes, it's just like, no, just
Yeah,
let me finish.
exactly.
Like, listen to his point. And
Mhm.
then it's like, yeah, and like agree with it or disagree with it and continue the conversation, and it not be about me being right or you being right, but about us both learning from the conversation.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. I like we've had quite a few points here where you and I have been on a bit of a different page, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just how we understand it, and we'll find out, you know?
Yeah, it's different perspectives, and it's we let each
Yeah.
other talk. We let the points be made. We made sure that we were understanding each other,
Yeah,
and not
exactly.
trying to straw man the other person. Just like, oh, this person thinks that you just need to be a ball chaser and you can be a pro. It's like
Right.
that would be a straw
Exactly.
man, you know.
Yeah.
Or this person needs game sense and you don't know how to need to know how to speed flip. It's like, well, you
Yeah,
know,
plus, like, what
yeah,
you've said, like, I'm going to be able to take into account later and be like, "Huh, maybe I was wrong on this stuff." Like, I don't necessarily think I'm right 100%, but it's like scientific data, you know? Like,
yeah,
I'm waiting for that stuff to show up, and then I can really see it, you know?
yeah. It's funny now just talking with my team, just like because we've gone over like different systems and stuff. Like it's
Mhm,
we'll be watching a pro game. There's like, oh my gosh, they're doing this, and it's like, yeah, like I don't
mhm.
know if they're calling it the same thing I am or if they're just kind of playing based off a field, but like this is the situation that I designed this system based off of because this team's doing this. And so now
Yeah.
we know when we're in this situation, we're going to call this play essentially.
Hmm. So how long have you been? So you've been in the bubble scene for how long now exactly?
Since April. So it was
April.
start of MPL. I got picked up right as MPL was starting by
Hmm.
Defiance. And so we've kind of gone through some roster changes and now we're with Audacity.
Hmm.
So I'm still relatively young in the bubble scene.
Hmm.
But
So you're still trying to find your way through the water then, right?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
I'm definitely a new kid on the block when it comes to that.
Yeah.
But I'm 28,
Mhm.
so I've got, like I said, on my Metafy profile, a 10 years of coaching slash teaching experience, from
Mhm.
music, uh, and I've been playing this game for off and on since 2016.
Mhm.
Uh, I really didn't have too much time to play, but I was always watching pro play, and I've always been like the analytical mind. So like I only
Same.
have probably like 800 hours actually playing it, but I have like 3K hours like studying it because
Yeah.
I'm a nerd.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
see, so how many other than me, like how many coaches have you discussed with?
So you're the first one. I've talked to a few other just like general coaches about like mentality stuff.
Mhm.
That's just the area of my coaching I've got to get up to snuff
Yeah,
is the mentality.
so I do highly encourage because I used to do the same thing, right? Like I used to be that analytical and that kind of nature. I highly encourage you to talk to pros in the scene and coaches in the scene, and don't expect them all to just say no. By the way, just
Oh
like
yeah.
a lot of them are open to talking and actually discussing this stuff, because they want the scene to grow. They don't want it to just there's no like selfish aspect towards it, in a
Yeah.
lot of cases, um, and get that perspective because like I took the worst route possible.
Hmm.
I took I took 6 years, right? So I had 5 years of failure to learn from
Hmm.
over time. And this last year that I'm running in, everything is starting to like really look good. Like players in the bubble scene that I'm working with are seeing immediate improvement and everyone's on a good mood and teams are thriving. It's just like a really hard thing to find out until you really know like what's going on and you can't so like the current meta trying to find the opposite meta, right? Or trying to find like another meta that works against it. There's a reason the meta stayed alive the way it did.
Yeah.
And so it's still very important to acknowledge the longevity of that because otherwise if you try and put them in strategies and like formulas and you will like or if you will then you run into a lot of like you're making them robots kind of thought process. So,
Hmm.
so once again, you have to be very careful off that because it's not like football, right?
Oh
You
yeah.
you
There's
can't have
definitely
like
differences.
yeah yeah. So I would say like playbooks aren't really formulated at least in football, right? Like playbooks aren't really formulated for the sake of saying this is how a player plays, right?
To
Or is it more about like
to a certain extent, it's more
mhm.
this player's doing this to enable this to happen
Yeah,
or this
exactly.
to
It's like
happen. So
setting things it's setting the
yeah,
pieces in place, right? Like letting things fall into place,
yeah, it's like
right?
for instance, like for football, like if you have somebody running, like you have your wide receiver, he's running a go route, so he's basically just sprinting down the field as fast as he can. His
Mhm.
goal for that is either to outrun the safety or to create space on that side of the field for the
Mhm.
person running the post route,
Mhm.
who's basically going to be coming in a little bit late and kind of cutting out to that open space. So, like, that's the design of that side of the field. Or you could also have, while this is happening, you're having somebody else run from the right side to the left side to give
Mhm.
that person even more open space. And so it's like there is the goal of the play, but there's also like all these different layers, and it takes a quarterback to read what option is best and then mechanically execute.
Yeah.
Uh,
But during that whole time, you're still telling them like what to do as a coach, right?
to a certain extent, it's like this is what we're going for,
Mhm.
and one of these things is going to happen, or we're gonna throw the ball away and just try and get to the next down. Uh, and so like for that it would be like, hey, we're gonna try this, or we're gonna be in a position that we can either shadow or just hit the ball back into their side and start our next rotation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that'll be interesting to see how it's implemented into Rocket League teams in that sense. Um, and I'd be very interested to know if that is what's going on at the top 4 level. But like I said, all I can do at this point is speculate on that until I really get into conversations with them, you know?
Oh yeah.
So, no, this has been interesting. This has been really cool to find out your perspective and take on things and get an idea for it. And then how we both agree that 6-mans is kind of a problem right now.
Yeah. I think using 6-mans is like probably the biggest. Like it's almost becoming
It's the
as
only
much
way
of
so far, though, right? Like,
yeah.
what other way is there to get to know everyone at the high skill, right? It's like, yeah, you could do ranked and try and get up there and all that, but unless you're like doing 6-mans, it doesn't like doing ranked doesn't show that you're functional in a team.
Yeah.
Doing 6-mans is the closest thing to show that you're functional in a team right now, at least.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. That's why I say I think the coaching aspect is we're gonna be coming closer into that era where the coaching is more important. Not more important as in like the most important thing, but I think that having a coach that's like really a coach and not just your buddy, like, you know, back in season 1 to 3 that you wanted to give a free pass to RLCS to, you know, like having coaches to solidify teams and then those teams stick together and work through stuff. I think that's going to be more important. And I can start to see
sorry, go ahead.
closer to a top-down approach. I don't think it'll ever be 100% org picks coach and then coach picks players and then like that team's immediately successful or like very successful. But I think it's like on a spectrum, like it's been so much in the players' hands that I think things are going to eventually start to shift to where orgs are not just trying to pick up a team, they're trying to build something themselves and find a good coach, and then that coach find good players. And I think, like we talked about with Kosnian, you know, or however you pronounce his name. I'm sorry.
Ronskin, yeah.
Ronskin, yeah. Like I think that's the first team that I'm seeing do this. But I think again, it's going to be that spectrum. You're going to recruit one player, and they typically have their best friend that, you know, they vibe really well with, and is also a good player. You know. So,
I don't know. It'd be interesting, definitely.
Yeah. So, anything you want to tell the listeners before we do a little outro?
Yeah, I'll do my shameless plug.
Yeah, shameless plugs. Let's go.
So you can follow me on Twitter at UltiRL. So Ulti like ultimate. So ULTI and then RL for Rocket League. And then on Metafy, it's metafy.gg/@ and then Ulti. Just all lowercase.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely go check him out. If you are a rank B and up player, he does give away quite a few coaching sessions on Twitter.
I do all ranks, all skills, maybe.
Yeah.
Just work with me.
Yeah. Definitely check him out on Metafy. He's been around for a minute. Definitely fun actually sitting down and talking with you for a change instead of being on the opposite side of the pitch.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It was nice meeting you.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. You guys have a good day.